You ever romanticize something that would have killed you in about 3 days? Yeah, we all do. You scroll through cabin porn on Instagram, dreaming of escaping to the woods, forgetting you'd die of dysentery before you figured out how to make soap. That's exactly what we did to the Wild West. We turned hell into a fantasy. We took a place where children died of snake bites and turned it into a bedtime story. America didn't just love the Wild West, we needed it to be beautiful, because admitting the truth meant admitting we built a nation on a graveyard of broken teeth and empty promises. Picture this, it's 1876, you're standing in Dodge City, and the smell hits you first. Not gunpowder, not leather. Shit, human and horse baking in the Kansas sun, mixed with rotting meat and unwashed bodies that haven't seen water in weeks. The street isn't dusty and romantic. It's a sewage ditch with delusions of grandeur. A man stumbles past you, missing 2 fingers and half his face, not from a dramatic shootout, but from an infected tooth that ate through his jaw because the nearest dentist is 300 miles away and probably drunk. This is the West. This is what we turned into Disneyland. But here's the thing that'll mess with your head. They loved it. Not because it was good, because it was theirs. Because for the first time in human history, you could be a nobody from nowhere and rewrite your entire existence just by riding far enough west that no one knew your name. You could be a coward in Boston and a gunslinger in Tombstone. You could be a failure in New York and a landowner in Montana. The West didn't care who you were. It only cared if you survived long enough to become someone else. And that's the drug. That's why we can't let it go. The mythology started before the bodies were even cold. Dime novels in the 1880s were pumping out stories about heroic cowboys and noble outlaws, while the real West was still actively killing people. Buffalo Bill Cody was touring Europe with his Wild West show, literally performing a fake version of a place that was still real, and people ate it up because the truth was too ugly, too random, too pointless. A man named Tom Horn was hanging horse thieves while Buffalo Bill was pretending to shoot Indians with blanks in front of Queen Victoria. The fiction was happening simultaneously with the reality, and somehow the fiction won. You want to know what a real cowboy was? Not John Wayne, not Clint Eastwood. A real cowboy was a low-paid laborer, often black or Mexican, hired to babysit cows across 1,000 miles of nothing, eating beans that gave him dysentery, sleeping in the rain, getting trampled, bitten, infected, sun-poisoned, and if he was lucky, he'd make it to 30 before dying of something stupid like a infected paper cut or falling off a horse wrong. There was no honor in it. It was just survival with better marketing. But here's where it gets twisted. The people who actually lived through it started believing the myth too. Wyatt Earp spent the last decades of his life consulting on Hollywood Western films, shaping his own legend, turning a mediocre lawman who mostly ran gambling operations into an icon of frontier justice. He helped Bill lie about himself. And we let him, because we desperately needed someone to be the hero in a story that didn't have any. Let's talk about the women, because history loves to forget them. You think the West was all saloon girls with hearts of gold? Try this. Women on the frontier were dying in childbirth at rates that would make a war zone blush, often alone, often in sod houses that were literally caves cut into dirt hills, giving birth in the dark while their husbands were miles away trying to keep crops alive in soil that didn't want them. If the baby survived, there was cholera, typhoid, diphtheria waiting like a lineup of death. If she survived, there was the slow, soul-crushing isolation of living 20 miles from the nearest human being, going weeks without hearing another woman's voice, losing her mind so slowly she didn't notice until she was talking to the walls. But here's the romantic part we cling to. Some of them thrived. Not because it was easy, but because they were finally free from the corsets and parlors and polite suffocation of Eastern society. Women in the West could own land, run businesses, shoot guns, wear pants, and tell men to go to hell without losing their reputation because reputation didn't exist yet. The West was an apocalypse, but apocalypses are strangely egalitarian. When everyone's dying, no one cares about your gender. They care if you can work. Wait, stop here for a second. I need to ask you something real. Have you ever wanted to burn your entire life down and start over somewhere no one knows your name? If that thought has ever kept you awake at night, drop a comment. Just write, "I felt this," because that's the real reason the West haunts us. It's not about cowboys. It's about escape, and that matters. Now let's talk about the violence, because you think you know, but you don't. The famous gunfights? Rare. Most people in the West never saw one. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted 30 seconds and was mostly just chaos and missed shots. But the slow violence? That was everywhere. The violence of a mother burying 3 children before their 5th birthdays. The violence of a farmer losing everything to a drought and putting a bullet in his head in a barn while his family slept. The violence of Native Americans being systematically erased, not dramatically in battles, but bureaucratically, through starvation, disease, forced relocation, watching their children stolen and renamed in boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. That violence doesn't sell movie tickets, so we don't talk about it. Here's the part that'll really mess with you. The people doing the violence thought they were heroes. They genuinely believed they were bringing civilization to a savage land, that manifest destiny was a divine mission, that the suffering was necessary because progress always costs blood. And they weren't monsters. They were just people who convinced themselves that their dream mattered more than someone else's life. Sound familiar? And the outlaws we worship? Jesse James wasn't Robin Hood. He was a bitter Confederate guerrilla who robbed trains and murdered civilians because he couldn't accept that the South lost. Billy the Kid wasn't a charming rogue. He was a traumatized kid who killed at least 8 men and died at 21, shot in the dark by a sheriff who didn't even give him a chance to draw. We turned these broken, violent men into legends because we needed the West to mean something more than random cruelty in a lawless wasteland. But the wildest part? It only lasted about 30 years. The Wild West, as we imagine it, the gunslingers, the open range, the lawless frontier, existed roughly from 1865 to 1895. 1 generation. The same amount of time between now and the late 90s. That's it. And in that sliver of history, we created a mythology so powerful, it defines American identity to this day. If stories like this one hit you deeper than they should, if you crave the truth that history tried to bury, then you belong here. Subscribe before the next secret burns its way out. So why do we love it? Why can't we let the West die? Because it's the last time America could lie to itself about what it was becoming. The West was the final frontier, where you could still pretend hard work and grit mattered more than money and connections, where you could still believe the myth that any man could carve out his own destiny, even though it was never really true, even though the railroads and banks and corporations were already there, pulling strings, buying land, controlling everything. For a brief, bloody moment, it felt possible. And we've been chasing that feeling ever since. Every time someone quits their job to start a business, every time someone moves across the country to reinvent themselves, every time someone says they're going to make it on their own terms, that's the ghost of the Wild West whispering in their ear. It's the same lie, the same beautiful, necessary, deadly lie that you can escape your past and build something new with your bare hands. The truth is uglier and more complicated. The West was stolen land soaked in blood, built on the bones of people who were there first, sold to desperate immigrants and freed slaves with promises that mostly turned to dust. It was a corporate land grab dressed up as freedom. It was genocide with a soundtrack. It was everything wrong with America and everything we pretend is right about it,
all happening at the same time. And yet, some of them did make it. Some of them did build something. Not because the system was fair, but because they were too stubborn or too desperate or too crazy to give up. And that's the truth we can't let go of.
Not the myth of the heroic cowboy, but the reality of the human being who kept walking into the sun even though they knew it was probably going to kill them. Because maybe that's what America actually is, not the destination, not the dream fulfilled, but the walk itself. The stupid, stubborn, often doomed march towards something better, even when better doesn't exist, even when you're dying of dysentery in a hole in the ground 1,000 miles from anyone who remembers your real name. You think you'd never romanticize your own suffering like that. You think you'd see through the mythology, recognize the manipulation, refuse to call hell beautiful. But maybe that's exactly what they thought too, right before they packed their wagons and headed west into the dust, believing this time would be different, believing they would be the exception, believing the lie because the truth of staying put was worse than the risk of dying free. The West wasn't heaven.
It was barely even real, but God, we needed it to be.